macabre history of the Masons. They buried millions beneath the house. Their kids never left in the heart of Millbrook Heights, a perfectly manicured suburban neighborhood where white picket fences and morning joggers paint the picture of American tranquility. Stands a house that defies the natural order of things. Number 1247 Elm Street appears. Unremarkable at first glance, too stony, colonial with faded blue shutters and a wraparound porch that has seen better decades. But for those who have lived in Millbrook Heights long enough, this house represents something far more unsettling than mere architectural decline. It is the house where children never leave. The Mason family has occupied 1247 Elm Street for over 60 years, and in all that time, not a single Mason child has ever moved out. 3 generations have been born, raised, and aged within those walls, creating a phenomenon so unusual that it has become the subject of whispered conversations at neighborhood barbecues and worried discussions at PTA meetings. The current occupants include Edmund Mason, 78 years old, the family patriarch who inherited the house from his father in 1963. With him live his 4 children, Margaret, 55, Robert, 52, Patricia, 49, and David, 46. None of them have ever married. None have ever held jobs outside the immediate neighborhood. None have ever expressed any desire to experience life beyond the boundaries of their inherited home. But the strangeness doesn't end there. Margaret's 3 children, now adults in their 20s and 30s, also remain in the house, along with Robert's twin sons and Patricia's daughter. 13 people spanning 3 generations live under one roof, sharing bedrooms like children at an eternal sleepover, eating meals together in shifts because the dining room table can't accommodate them all, and moving through their daily routines with the mechanical precision of actors performing the same play, night after night. The neighbors of Millbrook Heights have watched this peculiar arrangement unfold for decades with a mixture of curiosity and unease. Mrs. Henderson, who has lived next door since 1971, remembers when the Mason children were young, how they would play in the backyard like any other children, but always returned to the house before dark and never ventured beyond the property line without an adult family member. As the years passed, the oddities multiplied. The Mason children attended local schools but never participated in extracurricular activities. They never brought friends home. They never went to sleepovers or birthday parties. When they reached driving age, they learned to drive but never owned cars. When they graduated high school, they didn't go to college or seek employment. They simply remained at home, as if the very idea of leaving had never occurred to them. The 3rd generation of Masons displayed the same inexplicable behavior. Margaret's eldest son, Thomas, is now 32 years old and has never been on a date, never applied for a job, never expressed interest in anything beyond the walls of 1247 Elm Street. His siblings and cousins follow the same pattern, moving through their 20s and 30s with the quiet resignation of people who have accepted their fate without question. What makes this situation particularly disturbing to outside observers is not just the family's isolation, but their apparent contentment with it. When approached by concerned neighbors or social workers over the years, the Masons have always been polite but firm in their insistence that they are happy with their arrangement. They speak of family loyalty, of the importance of staying together, of obligations that outsiders wouldn't understand. But there are cracks in their facade that have begun to show more prominently in recent years. The house itself seems to be deteriorating at an accelerated pace, as if the weight of so many lives contained within its walls is causing it to collapse inward. The foundation has developed significant settling issues, causing doors to stick and floors to slope at alarming angles. The basement, which has always been off limits to visitors and neighborhood children, occasionally emits strange odors that the Masons explain away as problems with their antiquated plumbing system. More troubling are the sounds that neighbors report hearing. especially during the quiet hours after midnight. Mrs. Henderson has called the police on 3 separate occasions. Reporting what she described as digging sounds coming from the Mason property, the rhythmic scraping of metal against earth, sometimes lasting for hours. Each time, the police found nothing amiss. The Masons explained that they were doing late-night gardening or home improvement projects, working at odd hours to avoid disturbing their neighbors during the day. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the Mason family mystery is what happens to those who ask too many questions. In 1989, a social worker named Karen Mills became concerned about the living conditions at 1247 Elm Street and launched an informal investigation. She visited the house twice, interviewed several family members, and was preparing a report when she suddenly transferred to another state, leaving behind friends, family, and a promising career. She never returned, never called, and never responded to attempts to contact her. In 1995, a local journalist named David Pierce began researching the Mason family for a human interest story about multi-generational households. He conducted several interviews with neighbors and visited the county records office to research the property's history. 3 weeks into his investigation, Pierce's editor killed the story, citing lack of public interest. Pierce himself seemed to lose all enthusiasm for the project and never mentioned it again. Most recently, in 2019, a graduate student in sociology named Amanda Chen chose the Mason family as the subject of her thesis on unusual family structures in American suburbia. She had permission to conduct interviews and was making excellent progress when she abruptly changed her thesis topic to something completely unrelated when pressed by her advisor about the sudden change. Chen claimed she had lost interest and refused to discuss her research on the Masons any further. The pattern is clear. Those who dig too deeply into the Mason family's affairs either disappear, relocate unexpectedly, or suddenly lose all interest in their investigation. This has created an atmosphere of unspoken dread around 1247 Elm Street. A sense that the house harbors secrets that some powerful force is determined to keep hidden as our story begins in earnest. The first major crack in the Mason family's carefully maintained facade is about to appear. The catalyst comes in the form of city-mandated utility worker. Routine replacement of century-old sewer lines that requires excavation around the foundations of several houses in the neighborhood, including 1247 Elm Street. The Mason family's response to this announcement is immediate and extreme. Edmund Mason, usually a quiet and retiring man, becomes agitated to the point of aggression, demanding that the work be postponed or rerouted. When city officials explain that the work is mandatory and cannot be avoided, the entire Mason family begins displaying signs of severe stress. Neighbors report seeing them having heated discussions on their front porch, something that has never happened before in anyone's memory. Margaret Mason is observed pacing the property line at all hours, day and night, as if standing guard. The younger generation, usually invisible to their neighbors, suddenly begins appearing in the yard, watching the street with expressions of barely contained panic. The family stops leaving the house entirely, even for their usual brief errands to the nearby grocery store. Mrs. Henderson, whose bedroom window overlooks the Mason backyard, reports seeing the family engaging in what appears to be frantic digging in their garden, working by flashlight in the pre-dawn hours. The sound of shovels against earth, muffled conversations, and the occasional thud of something heavy being moved creates a symphony of midnight activity that has kept the entire neighborhood on edge. But it's the discovery made by a city worker on the morning of March 15th that finally begins to unravel the mystery that has shrouded 1247 Elm Street for over half a century, while running a ground-penetrating radar survey to map the underground utilities. Technician Miguel Rodriguez notices an anomaly in the readings beneath the Mason property, a large, rectangular void approximately 8 feet below the surface, extending far beyond what would be expected for a normal basement or crawl space. Rodriguez, a 20-year veteran of utility work who has seen his share of underground oddities, is struck by something else. The radar indicates that this underground space appears to be filled with dense metallic objects arranged in neat, organized rows. The signature is unlike anything he has encountered before. Not rocks, not pipes, not the usual debris of construction and demolition that often lies buried beneath older properties. When Rodriguez reports his findings to his supervisor, the response is immediate and concerning. The supervisor, after making several phone calls to unknown parties, instructs Rodriguez to file a standard report noting no underground obstructions, and to proceed with the utility work as planned. When Rodriguez protests that this falsifies his actual findings, he is told that he must have misread the equipment, and that questioning the directive could result in termination. But Rodriguez, a man of integrity who takes pride in his work, secretly photographs the radar readings and makes copies of his original notes. He has no idea what he has stumbled upon, but his instincts tell him that something significant lies buried beneath the Mason house, something that powerful people want to keep hidden. As Chapter 1 draws to a close, the stage is set for revelations that will shake not just the Mason family and the residents of Millbrook Heights, but potentially the entire understanding of American history itself. The secret that has kept 3 generations of Masons prisoner in their own home is about to be exposed, and the truth will prove to be more horrifying than anyone could have imagined. The sounds of digging that have disturbed the piece of Elm Street for decades are about to make perfect, terrible sense. The millions referenced in whispered neighborhood rumors are real, but they are not what anyone suspects, and the Mason family's desperate attempt to keep their children from ever leaving home is not a result of overprotective parenting or psychological dysfunction. It is a matter of survival, both for them and for the secret that lies buried beneath their feet. The excavation is scheduled to begin tomorrow morning, and with it, the final chapter of a deception that has lasted longer than most of the neighbors have been alive. The truth begins to emerge at 6:47 a.m. on a gray Tuesday morning when the excavation crew breaks through a layer of seemingly normal suburban soil and encounters something that stops the work immediately. The backhoe operator, a man named Frank Kowalski, who has been digging foundations and utility trenches for 30 years, later describes the moment as like breaking through the roof of hell itself. What the excavation reveals is not utilities, not old construction debris, not any of the mundane underground discoveries that typically accompany suburban construction projects. Instead, 8 feet beneath the carefully maintained lawn of 1247 Elm Street, the machinery uncovers the edge of an enormous underground chamber, a space that extends far beyond the boundaries of the Mason property and appears to contain systematic rows of what can only be described as burial sites. But these are not ordinary graves. As the excavation expands and forensic archaeologists are called to the scene, the true scope and horror of the discovery becomes apparent. The underground chamber contains thousands upon thousands of individual burial sites, each marked with a small metal plate bearing numbers instead of names. The bodies are not in coffins, but are wrapped in canvas shrouds and arranged with military precision in perfect geometric patterns that stretch far beyond what the initial radar surveys had indicated. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, the forensic anthropologist leading the investigation, makes a discovery that chills her to the bone. The metal identification plates are not random numbers, they correspond to a systematic cataloging system, and the numbers are far too high for this to be a simple unmarked cemetery. The plates she examines range from the hundreds of thousands into the millions, suggesting a burial ground of unprecedented scope hidden beneath the suburban facade of Millbrook Heights. As the investigation expands and more of the underground chamber is revealed, the horrifying truth about the Mason family begins to emerge. The house at 1247 Elm Street is not just built over this massive burial ground, it serves as its guardian post, its watchtower, its keeper of secrets that were meant to remain buried forever. The story that unfolds through forensic evidence, historical records, and eventually through the confession of Edmund Mason himself, reveals one of the darkest chapters in American history, a chapter that has been systematically erased from official records and hidden beneath layers of bureaucratic deception and deliberate forgetfulness. The burial ground beneath Millbrook Heights is the final resting place of over 2 million victims of what government documents euphemistically referred to as Operation Silent Harbor, a covert program conducted between 1942 and 1965 that eliminated individuals deemed undesirable or problematic by a shadow organization operating within the federal government. Unlike the well-documented horrors of Nazi concentration camps, Operation Silent Harbor was designed to be invisible, to eliminate its victims without leaving any trace of their existence. The targets were not ethnic or religious minorities, but individuals who posed perceived threats to national security, political dissidents, whistleblowers, journalists who investigated the wrong stories, scientists who asked uncomfortable questions, and ordinary citizens who simply witnessed things they were not supposed to see. The victims were systematically kidnapped, murdered with untraceable methods, and transported to burial sites across the country. Millbrook Heights, chosen for its isolation and the presence of deep underground caverns formed by ancient limestone deposits, became the primary burial ground for the eastern region of the operation. Edmund Mason's father, George Mason, was one of the operation's key architects, a high-ranking government official with connections to intelligence agencies that officially didn't exist. George Mason was tasked with overseeing the burial operations and ensuring that the secret remained buried along with its victims, in exchange for his silence and his service as permanent guardian of the site. The Mason family was provided with financial security and government protection, but the protection came with a price that George Mason didn't fully understand when he agreed to the arrangement. The government handlers who managed Operation Silent Harbor had learned from historical examples that secrets of this magnitude could only be kept if the keepers themselves were trapped within the system. The Mason family was not just paid to guard the burial ground, they were made prisoners of it. The house at 1247 Elm Street was constructed with hidden surveillance equipment. Its phone lines were permanently monitored, and its residents were kept under constant observation. More crucially, the government handlers made it clear that any Mason family member who attempted to leave the property permanently would be considered a security risk and dealt with accordingly. The family's apparent contentment with their isolated lifestyle was not natural. It was the result of generations of psychological conditioning and implied threats. The children never left because they couldn't leave. The adults never sought outside employment because they weren't allowed to. The family's strange behavior was not the result of psychological dysfunction, but of carefully orchestrated control designed to ensure their silence and compliance. As the excavation continues and more evidence emerges, investigators discover that the burial ground extends far beyond the Mason property. The underground chamber stretches beneath most of Millbrook Heights, explaining why the neighborhood has always felt slightly off to visitors and why several other longtime residents have displayed unusual behavioral patterns over the decades. Ground penetrating radar reveals that the chamber contains not just individual graves, but larger spaces that appear to have been used for mass disposal operations. Dr. Mitchell's team discovers evidence of systematic processing facilities, underground rooms, where victims were prepared for burial, where personal effects were sorted and destroyed, where all traces of individual identity were methodically erased. The scope of the cover-up becomes clear as investigators trace the paper trail of Operation Silent Harbor. Fake death certificates were created for many victims, listing mundane causes of death and burial locations in distant states. Families who inquired about missing relatives were told that their loved ones had died in classified military operations, or had been relocated for national security reasons. Some families received death benefits and carefully forged documentation of military service that never existed. The most chilling discovery comes when investigators realized that Operation Silent Harbor never officially ended. While the bulk of the killings ceased in 1965, the infrastructure for disposing of problematic individuals remained in place, used sporadically over the decades whenever the need arose. Miguel Rodriguez's radar findings had inadvertently exposed not just a historical atrocity, but an ongoing operation that powerful interests were still determined to protect. This explains the pattern of people who investigated the Mason family and then suddenly disappeared or lost interest. Karen Mills, the social worker who transferred to another state in 1989, is found to have died in a car accident just 6 months after her relocation, an accident that occurred under circumstances that investigators now find highly suspicious. David Pierce, the journalist whose story was killed in 1995, suffered a stroke at the age of 38 that left him with severe memory loss. Unable to remember anything about his investigation, Amanda Chen, the graduate student whose thesis advisor pressured her to change topics, reveals under FBI protection that she had received anonymous threats after her first interview with the Mason family. The threats were specific and terrifying, describing in detail what would happen to her family if she continued her research. The Mason family's confession, obtained after Edmund Mason suffers a psychological breakdown when confronted with the evidence, reveals the full extent of their trapped existence. For over 60 years, they have lived as prisoners in their own home, forced to maintain the fiction of a normal family life while serving as guardians of one of the largest mass graves in American history. Edmund describes how his father, George, gradually realized the magnitude of what he had become involved in, how the weight of guarding millions of victims drove him to alcoholism and early death. He explains how each generation of Mason children was indoctrinated from birth to understand their role as keepers of the secret, how they were taught that leaving the house would result not just in their own deaths but in the exposure of secrets that would destroy the fabric of American society. The psychological conditioning was so complete that most Mason family members genuinely believed they were serving their country by maintaining their isolation. They saw themselves not as prisoners, but as patriots, sacrificing their freedom to protect national security. Only as the weight of evidence mounted did some family members begin to question whether their sacrifice was justified. The investigation into Operation Silent Harbor ultimately exposes a network of corruption and murder that reaches into the highest levels of government, spanning multiple administrations and involving hundreds of individuals who either participated in the killings or helped cover them up. The burial ground beneath Millbrook Heights is revealed to be just one of several similar sites across the country, part of a systematic program of domestic terrorism conducted by the American government against its own citizens. The Mason family, after 60 years of imprisonment, finally leaves 1247 Elm Street under federal protection. The house is demolished, and the site becomes a memorial to the victims of Operation Silent Harbor. The neighborhood of Millbrook Heights is evacuated as the full extent of the burial ground is excavated, and the victims are given proper burial with their identities restored, whenever possible. But the story of the Masons serves as a chilling reminder that the most horrific crimes are often hidden in plain sight, disguised as normalcy, and protected by the very institutions meant to serve justice. The children who never left home were not victims of overprotective parenting or psychological dysfunction. They were prisoners of a system that prioritized secrecy over human life, that sacrificed individual freedom to protect institutional power. The millions buried beneath 1247 Elm Street finally receive recognition and justice, but their deaths serve as a permanent reminder of what happens when governments operate in shadows and ordinary citizens become expendable in the service. of hidden agendas. The Mason family's macabre history is ultimately America's macabre history, a story of how fear, control, and the pursuit of absolute power can turn suburban neighborhoods into graveyards, and loving families into unwilling accomplices to mass murder. The house that time forgot has finally revealed its secrets. But the questions it raises about power, complicity, and the price of silence will haunt the American consciousness for generations to come.
Thank you for watching another tale unfold here on NW Storytime. Every story hides a secret, and tonight you uncovered another one. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I'd love to know how far these stories travel. If you enjoyed this mystery, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. It helps us keep the secrets alive. Until next time, stay curious,